Nobody saw it coming. Not the journalists with their courtside press passes. Not the seasoned coaches who'd watched 1,000 tournaments blur into one. Not even the players who'd spent years grinding through the circuit, learning to expect the unexpected. One afternoon in Rome changed everything, and it started with a black motorcade pulling up outside the Foro Italico like it owned the place. A 19-year-old from Manila, a Saudi prince with billions behind him, and Rafael Nadal standing nearby with an expression that launched 1,000 arguments. $2 million sitting in the middle of it all like a question nobody was brave enough to answer first. But before we get to the money, before we get to the moment that broke the internet and split the tennis world down the middle, you need to understand who Alex Eala actually is, because that context is everything. She wasn't discovered. She wasn't gifted a pathway. She carved one, slowly, painfully, with the kind of discipline that most people read about in motivational content but never actually live. Growing up in Manila, she carried the weight of a dream that felt too large for the circumstances surrounding it. Filipino tennis wasn't exactly drowning in global investment. The infrastructure, the funding, the institutional support that players from wealthier nations take completely for granted, none of that was waiting for her. What she had instead was hunger, genuine burning hunger, and eventually a place at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Spain, where talent goes to be tested and either sharpened or broken. The academy doesn't coddle anyone. You earn your place there every single morning. While other teenagers were living normal lives, Alex was studying footwork until her legs ached, rewatching match footage to find angles most players never bother looking for, and conditioning her mind to stay locked in during the exact moments when pressure tries to pry your focus loose. The WTA circuit is one of the most brutally competitive environments in professional sport. The margins are razor thin, the physical demand is unrelenting, and the psychological warfare is constant and invisible. Plenty of talented players arrive with promise and leave with permanent damage to their confidence. Alex didn't just survive it. She started to thrive in ways that began turning heads among people paid to notice these things. By the time the 2025 Italian Open arrived, she wasn't a curiosity anymore. She was a genuine threat. Ranked opponents were now specifically preparing for her rather than treating her as a manageable obstacle between them and someone they actually worried about. The Foro Italico in spring is one of those places that reminds you why sport exists. The clay courts carry this warm terracotta color under the Roman sun. The surrounding architecture feels ancient and epic, and the crowd brings an energy that's part passion, part theater. Alex arrived there focused, professional, methodical. She was building momentum through the clay court swing, collecting ranking points, reminding the tennis establishment that her presence at the top wasn't accidental and wasn't temporary. Nobody expected Rome to be anything other than another important step forward. And then one ordinary afternoon, everything stopped being ordinary. The motorcade appeared and the atmosphere shifted before anyone understood why. Security personnel seemed to multiply out of thin air. Whispers moved through the media section like a current. Something significant had entered the building, and the entire carefully managed world of professional tennis quietly reorganized itself around whatever that something was. Prince Abdullah had a reputation that preceded him even in rooms where nobody announced him. His family's wealth spans industries that reshape entire economies, and his personal interest in sports investment had already left fingerprints across Formula One, boxing, golf, and football. Tennis had been the notable gap in that portfolio. He'd attended major events before, but this was different. Witnesses later described how he specifically requested access to watch Eala's practice session. Not a semi-final. Not a showcase match with cameras everywhere. A practice session. That detail matters more than people initially gave it credit for. You don't cross continents to watch someone practice unless your interest is serious, studied, and rooted in something more substantial than casual appreciation. He watched for 40 minutes. Spoke to almost nobody. His expression stayed completely unreadable in the way that people who make enormous decisions tend to look right before they commit to anything. When it was over, a member of his delegation approached Eala's management team with a simple message. The prince wanted to meet. Now think about what that request represented in 2025. Saudi Arabia had spent years building a global sports empire with a transparency that was almost bold. The ambition was never disguised. They wanted to be at the center of international athletic culture, and they were willing to spend whatever it took to get there. Tennis remained the final major frontier. And standing on a Roman practice court with clay dust settling around her shoes was a 19-year-old from the Philippines. Young, genuinely exceptional, representing a nation with one of the most passionate and digitally engaged sports fan bases in all of Southeast Asia. From a strategic standpoint, she wasn't just an interesting prospect. She was an architectural opportunity. The meeting happened that evening. Small room, controlled environment, no recording devices. The kind of conversation that operates at a frequency ordinary people only detect years later when they notice something in the world has quietly shifted. The specific details stayed private by mutual agreement. But what emerged from it, the announcement made the following afternoon, left absolutely nothing open to interpretation. The number hit the room like a physical thing. $2 million. Not through a corporate sponsorship structure buried in legal documents. Not as an anonymous wire transfer processed through intermediaries. A direct, personal, publicly witnessed commitment of $2 million toward Alex Eala's career. Training resources, international infrastructure, a dedicated performance support team. The representative who delivered the announcement spoke in measured, precise English to a room full of sponsors, officials, journalists, and players. For about 3 full seconds, the silence was total. Then the room exploded. Journalists were reaching for phones before the representative had fully finished speaking. Players were doing the emotional mathematics that competitive athletes involuntarily perform when someone in their orbit receives resources they themselves understand the value of. Genuine happiness mixed with that deeply human reflex of quietly calculating what you could have done with the same support. Tournament officials scrambled because nothing in their existing protocols had ever needed to account for a moment quite like this one. And at the center of all of it stood Alex. Composed in a way that impressed everyone who watched her closely. Not frozen, not overwhelmed, not performing. Composed. The face of someone who had worked toward recognition for so long that when it arrived in this form, the emotional processing required a privacy that no camera could fully access. She thanked the prince with real warmth. She mentioned the Philippines immediately, instinctively, the way someone does when they've always understood they were carrying more than just their own dream. She used the word responsibility. Then she used it again. Journalists who spoke to her in the days afterward said she kept returning to that word, like it was an anchor she needed to keep touching. Within hours, the internet had consumed the story and rebuilt it according to everyone's existing framework. Filipino social media lit up with a celebration that genuinely overwhelmed domestic trending topics. Athletes across disciplines, not just tennis, sent messages recognizing what this moment represented for young women from overlooked nations chasing sports careers the world hadn't fully decided to support yet. Then the critics arrived, and honestly, some of their questions deserved serious consideration. Was this genuine philanthropic investment in athletic excellence? Or was it a sophisticated piece of soft power designed to generate exactly the international headlines it was currently generating? Was there a meaningful difference between those two things? When male athletes accept this kind of patronage, does the scrutiny look anything like this? That last question in particular caught fire and burned in ways that made the broader conversation genuinely complicated and genuinely important. And then Rafael Nadal appeared in frame. Of course he did. Nadal doesn't exist in the same category as other former champions. He's not simply a man whose records will eventually live in history books. He is a living argument about what human dedication actually means, a daily refutation of every excuse anyone has ever offered for stopping short of their potential. When Nadal moves through a space, the room adjusts. When he speaks about tennis, the sport listens differently than it listens to anyone else. And when he says absolutely nothing, when he simply exists in a space where cameras are already rolling, the interpretation of that silence becomes an international event. He had a natural presence at the Foro Italico. His connection to Eala through the academy he founded in Mallorca gave everything an extra layer that storytellers and analysts immediately recognized. And so when cameras caught him in that moment, eyes moving briefly toward her in the seconds after the announcement, pausing in whatever conversation he was having, the speculation machine activated instantly. Was it pride? Concern? Something more complicated than either? The clip ran millions of times. People built entire arguments around 4 seconds of footage. Some read it as quiet satisfaction, a mentor witnessing a student receive the recognition he believed she'd always deserved. Others read hesitation, a man who understood the tennis world intimately enough to see complications in the moment that celebration was crowding out. The honest answer is that nobody actually knows. But the willingness to project meaning onto that silence said something real about how much this story had captured people's attention. Because by that point it wasn't really about the money anymore. It never truly was. The $2 million was the headline, but underneath it was something the tennis world had been quietly struggling with for years. How do you build genuine global reach when your sports infrastructure still quietly filters out talent from nations without the resources to develop it properly? Alex Eala had already answered part of that question through sheer relentless work. She'd shown up anyway. She'd found a way anyway. She'd pushed past the invisible barriers that most players from her background quietly accepted as permanent. But the question of who builds the bridges that make those journeys possible, that one remained wide open. Institutions? Governments? Private individuals with the resources and the vision to see talent before the rest of the world catches up? Or the athletes themselves, one disciplined, exhausting, magnificent day at a time? Rome didn't resolve that debate. Rome just gave it a human face specific enough that nobody could flatten it into a simple argument without losing something important. Because Alex Eala refused to be a symbol. She was a person with a game plan, a career, a nation watching her, and a word she kept returning to when the cameras found her. Responsibility. Not just to herself, not just to Filipino tennis, but to the question of what happens when extraordinary talent from an overlooked place finally meets the kind of recognition it always deserved. The conversation that Rome started is still running. And she's still playing.